هنالك الولايات لله الحق هو خير ثوابا وخير عقبا. Protection is only Allah's, the true one. He is best to reward and best in requiting. Chapter 18, verse 44 of the Holy Quran. 2 weeks ago, I was given the honor of delivering a Jummah khutbah, and I chose to talk to you about Surah Al-Kahf, chapter 18 of the Holy Quran, primarily because of a well-known hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ said, whoever recites Surah Al-Kahf on Jummah will have light shining from him from that Jummah to the next. And I wanted to introduce those not familiar with the surah to the 4 trials that are detailed in this chapter. So I talked about the first story from this chapter, about the trial of faith. And today I thought that I would continue with that, and I'd like to share with you the second story, which is about the trial of wealth, also known as the story of the man with 2 gardens. From verse 32 to verse 49 of chapter 18, 2 men are described. One is given blessings and fortune in the form of 2 gardens filled with grapevines, date palms and cornfields, and a river gushing between them. The other is alluded to as a poorer man, yet the poor man is described as a true believer in Allah, whereas the wealthy man displays arrogance. He says in verse 34, I have greater wealth than thou, and am mightier in followers. This he says to his poorer friend. And he begins to doubt the existence of Allah and the surety of the day of judgment, saying in verse 36, I think not that the hour will come, and even if I am returned to my Lord, I will certainly find a returning place better than this. And through these verses, we learn that as a result of his pride, ultimately his gardens and his wealth were destroyed by Allah. So who were these 2 men? In the first verse that they are mentioned, verse 32, the Arabic word masala is used, which translates to parable. It says, and set forth to them the parable of 2 men. This indicates that this isn't necessarily a true story, rather it's a kind of analogy used in order to illustrate a lesson to us. But I think it would be even more accurate to call this a living analogy, because exact situations like this do continue to take place today. You may also know of people in your own circle who, in front of you, may suddenly go from a very high stature to nothing at all, for example, through bankruptcy. Or think of leaders from recent history who have run dictatorships and then fallen from grace in the most humiliating ways. I remember a few years ago, a Bosnian politician, I hope I pronounce his name right, called Radovan Karadzic, was arrested for war crimes and the massacre of so many people from the back of a bus after he'd been on the run for 13 years. That kind of fall from grace is what is being described in this story in Surah Al-Kahf. But in his notes on this chapter, Maulana Muhammad Ali also offers another point of view. He writes that the parable of these men is used to illustrate the condition of the Christian and Muslim nations. The former, that is the Christian nations, received an abundance of the wealth of this life, as is indicated by the gardens of the rich man, while the Muslims were poorer in worldly possessions, but were richer in the heavenly blessings of Allah. And similar to the wealthy man, the Christians also reject the message of truth, and they boast like him, as is described in verse 34, I have greater wealth than thou, and am mightier in followers. In other words, they look down on others, especially Muslims. But basically the overall point here is that, like the wealthy man in this story, anyone who has been blessed with an abundance of wealth and provisions, such as eatables, money, family, property, etc., is actually under a test and a trial from Allah. We tend to associate the removal of blessings as a trial. So when we're under hardship, we recognize that as a test and a trial from Allah. But here we're being told that even an increase in blessings is actually a trial. And we must take a moment to reflect on what exactly is considered wealth in the eyes of Allah. I'm not talking about the elite upper classes here, or only millionaires and billionaires. I would say that each of us here today is wealthy. We all own cars, homes, we have lots of clothes, different clothes for summer, different clothes for winter, shoes. We have fresh food on our tables every day and every night, laptops, phones, TVs, and the list just goes on and on of things that have become a very basic part of our lives. So I would put it to you that it is all of us that these verses apply to as a warning of what happens when you get so caught up in your material things that you stop understanding the true purpose of this life. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the assets of the wealthy man, each time he takes credit for giving them to him. We made 2 gardens of grapevines, and we surround them with date palms, and between them we made cornfields. He does not simply say that the man owned these things. He is clear that he gave them to him. This is an important thing for any blessed person to remember, that your blessings, that is, all your assets, they are from Allah. In terms of language, I just want to make a side point about the use of the word we in the Quran. I think it's important that as Muslims we understand this, because of course Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is referring to himself. But what if someone was to read or listen to this and claim that, well, this just shows that we believe in more than one God, or someone is joined with God? But actually in many languages, sometimes a singular noun is referred to as a plural, which in English we call the royal we. And people in high offices, such as the Queen, for example, might refer to herself as we. And interestingly, very often in the Quran, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses we, as opposed to I, to refer to himself, the reference is to Allah doing something, an action on his part. And there is a talk I did about a couple of years ago about chapter 97, Surah Al-Qadr, which is available on VirtualMosque online, in which I talked about this in more detail and gave some examples of when we is used and when I is used, if you wanted to know more about this. And on the topic of language, I also want to talk about how wealth is described in this surah. Because I found it very interesting that we know that this man is rich, or we understand that he is richer than the other man, because of the description of his gardens and crops. There's no mention of money as such. Now today we have lots of benchmarks against which to measure a person's wealth, such as how big their house is, which postcode they live in, how many cars they have, or how much savings they have, etc. But it struck me that the value of all of these things can change over time as our needs change and as their availability changes. So what signified wealth a few years ago does not necessarily do so anymore, and what signifies wealth today might not do so tomorrow. Food, however, is a very basic need of human beings. And no matter what period of time you look into, we have always and we will always need food to survive. And I wondered, is that why the man in these verses is described as wealthy by using crops to allude to his riches? It sort of makes this parable relevant and applicable for all times, just as all of the teachings in the Quran are. And one of the main lessons from this story is to understand that our real destination is the life in the hereafter. And everything in this life, from our worldly possessions to even our children, are all temporary pleasures. Only by acknowledging this reality can one be successful in the trials of this world. Verse 46 reads, Al-malu wal-banuna zinatul hayatil dunya. Wealth and children are an adornment of this life, of this world. And the word used for children here is banun, which in one of the explanations of this surah that I read, it was suggested that this word doesn't just refer to your biological children, but also manpower, employees, armies, etc. And I wonder if we could go so far as to say that it includes friends. And what about social networks? In a digital age, people can get obsessed about and proud about how many followers they have on Twitter or LinkedIn, for example. And all of these things, we're being told, are an adornment and a source of trial for you. So, going back to these two men, the rich man and the poor man, what's the difference between them, apart from the fact that one is rich and one is poor? Well, let's look at what the poorer man says in comparison to his rich friend. He says, As for me, He, Allah, is my Lord, and I associate none with my Lord. In other words, he says, maybe you have everything that I don't. Maybe you have all the luxuries that this world can offer. But as for me, I have something that you don't. I have faith in the oneness and the trueness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You could say that he's seen the light, because he understands what is at the root of everything, from our existence to our possessions, who is responsible for it all. He says, Wherefore didst thou not say, when thou enterest thy garden, it is as Allah has pleased, there is no power save in Allah. So he advises his friend that when you enter your garden, or when you look around at all that you've been blessed with, why don't you say, MashaAllah, all of this is what Allah has pleased, and it is Allah who has created that garden from nothing. If He had not willed for it to be fertile, it wouldn't have been. And then, here is the most important part of the story. He says, If thou consider me as less than thee in wealth and children, then maybe my Lord will give me better than thy garden, and will send on thine a reckoning from heaven. He says, you may think that you have all those things that make you better than me, or the fact that I don't have as much as you makes me less than you, but I have faith that my Lord has something better in store for me. This, to me, is the crux of this story. Here is the real lesson to be learnt. Whatever you have in this life is not only from Allah in the first place, but is temporary in nature anyway. Be grateful for it, but realize that the real gardens, the real assets, and the real wealth are to come not in this life, and not necessarily to everyone, but to those that truly believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and are worthy of it in His eyes. But the wealthy man rejects the reality of the Day of Judgment, and he says, I think not that the hour will come. This is reflective of the attitude of people who bury their heads in the sand and live their lives without realizing the reality of death and the hereafter. The result of this man's ignorance is a lesson for us to understand the truth of this world and its easy come, easy go nature. Ultimately, everything will go, as is highlighted in verses 47 and 48, where it says, And the day when we cause the mountains to pass away, and thou seest the earth a levelled plain, and we gather them together, and we leave none of them behind. And they are brought before thy Lord in ranks. Now certainly you have come to us as we created you at first. Nay, you thought that we had not made an appointment for you. What's being described here is, of course, the Day of Judgment, the Day of Reckoning. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, you thought that we had not made an appointment for you. In other words, you became confident that you wouldn't be questioned on your actions. It's not necessary that to fall into this category, you openly reject the Day of Judgment as the wealthy man in this story does. You could be doing so through your actions every day. For example, when you know that you're doing something wrong, but you keep doing it, thinking that there'll be no repercussions. And maybe in this life there won't be. Maybe you get away with it. But by carrying on, indulging in actions that are wrong, you are indirectly challenging the reality of death and the hereafter. And very soon after, we learn what happens when you bury your head in the sand in this way. In verse 45, it is said that the parable of this man losing his wealth is like that of when water is sent down from the clouds, in other words, when it rains, and the herbage of the earth becomes luxuriant. But still, when the winds blow, the earth becomes dry again. So, no matter how much it might rain one day, it doesn't mean that the plants and the crops and the earth can get all that they need from that one rainfall. They still need water regularly. Just like if you eat a very big lunch today, it doesn't mean that you won't need lunch again the next day. So the sustenance from the rain, it's only temporary, just like the wealth of this world. Through death, we're all going to part from our worldly possessions anyway. But here's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is warning you, He can take away your blessings in this life as well, if He wanted to. Interestingly, it's not just the end of life in this world that is mentioned in these verses, but also the creation of life. In verse 37, the poorer man says to the wealthy man, "Disbelievest thou in Him who created thee of dust, then of a small life germ, then He made thee a perfect man?" Basically, he's questioning, how can anyone not believe in He who is responsible for the miracle of creation? Of all of Allah's miracles, it's no coincidence that this one is referred to here. Because even with scientific developments, it is still currently impossible to create life in any other way, outside of the womb as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has intended. Even amongst non-believers, this is considered an inexplicable miracle. If He can create us from nothing, why is it so difficult to believe that He will also bring us back to life on the Day of Judgment, and that He is the one who is providing for us? Finally, another important lesson that can be gained by looking at this story is by considering the personality of the wealthy man. He brags about his wealth to the poor man, but ultimately, who's the loser in the story? And so, one who has been blessed with wealth should not become arrogant about it. Never look down on others, because you don't know ultimately who is the wealthier person in the eyes of Allah. I'd like to share some hadiths with you about this as well. In the book of Tirmidhi, the Prophet ﷺ is reported to have said, "Whoever has a mustard seed's weight of pride or arrogance in his heart shall not be admitted into paradise. And whoever has a mustard seed's weight of faith in his heart shall not be admitted into the fire." And in the book of Bukhari, the Prophet has said, "May I tell you of the people of paradise? Every weak and poor, obscure person that people look down upon, but his oath remained fulfilled by Allah when he took an oath to do something. And may I inform you of the people of the hellfire? They are all those violent, arrogant, and stubborn people." So to conclude, in this story, just like all of the stories from Surah Al-Kahf, a human weakness is exposed. And the weakness and attachments that we have when it comes to our assets and worldly possessions are very real and something that we all experience at some point or another. And in the absolute worst case scenario, we can easily slip down the path of showing off and become quite proud of what we have, which, as these verses of the Holy Quran demonstrate, is a dangerous slope. May Allah protect us from all trials and not burden us with tests that we cannot bear, and may He guide us on the right path always, and forgive us if we have ever been arrogant and proud because of our material possessions. I'll leave you with the same verse that I opened with, verse 44. Protection is only Allah's, the true one. He is best to reward and best in requiting.